An emperor's greatest palace was never built on empty ground. Across continents and centuries, from the deserts of Mesopotamia to the mountains of Peru, supreme rulers repeatedly chose the same controversial foundations for their seats of power. They constructed their most opulent palaces directly atop the sacred ruins of those who came before. This was no coincidence of urban planning. It was a deliberate, sophisticated strategy, a silent language of dominance written in stone and mortar. By the end of this exploration, you will understand the hidden blueprint of imperial power and see the world's most famous monuments in an entirely new light. Why would a conqueror go to such lengths to build over a holy site when untouched land was available? What profound force did these leaders believe they were capturing? The answer reveals a startling truth about how authority is built, not just proclaimed. What does it truly mean to own a piece of the past? To grasp this silent strategy, we must first understand what these emperors were targeting. A sacred ruin was far more than old stones. It was a place where the spiritual power of a people was believed to be concentrated, a focal point for the devotion of generations. This could be the scorched foundations of a rival's grand temple, deliberately toppled to erase their gods. It could be the monumental burial mound of a vanquished dynasty, a hill containing the legacy of their ancestors. Sometimes it was a natural site, a mountain spring, a sacred grove, a cave imbued with deep meaning long before any stone was carved. These were not merely convenient building lots. They were reservoirs of cultural memory and divine connection. This pattern stands in stark contrast to simple urban redevelopment, where a new market or housing district might be built over an older one for practical reasons. What we are tracing is a specific, repeated choice. An emperor surveying his vast new domain did not just see empty land. He saw a map of invisible power lines, and he chose to build his throne room directly atop the most potent junction, the place where the old world's heart once beat. This was not about recycling bricks, it was about capturing a legacy. These sites pulsed with what ancient Romans called the genius loci, the spirit of a place. This was not a poetic metaphor but a deeply held belief in a tangible, accumulated energy. A sacred location, through centuries of prayer, ritual, and collective memory, was thought to become saturated with power. Its very soil and stones were charged like a spiritual battery. For a new ruler, this presented not a problem, but an unparalleled opportunity. Why would you build your capital on spiritually neutral ground when you could construct it upon the most potent, pre-charged site in the entire kingdom? It was the ultimate power play in a world where the divine and the political were inseparable. To command a people, you had to command their geography of belief. By placing his palace directly over a conquered tribe's most holy spring, or a rival dynasty's ancestral tomb, an emperor was performing a profound act of spiritual engineering. He was not erasing the old power, he was claiming it, channeling its ancient legitimacy into the foundations of his own reign. The message was clear and terrifying to those who understood the silent language of stone. Your gods now serve me, your ancestors now protect my throne. The very heart of your identity now beats only by my permission. This psychological conquest was far more complete than any military victory. You could rebuild an army, but how do you rebuild a sacred center that has been physically capped by your enemy's glittering palace? The genius loci, the spirit of the place, did not vanish. In the ruler's mind, it was simply captured and repurposed, its loyalty transferred through the sheer, overwhelming weight of new architecture. This architectural conquest was political theater on the grandest possible scale. Think of it not as construction, but as a permanent, silent proclamation carved into the landscape itself. Every citizen, every visiting diplomat, every future generation would look upon that glittering new palace and understand the unshakable truth it represented. The old gods had been supplanted. The former people's history was now literally the foundation for a new era. This was propaganda made not of parchment or speech, but of immovable stone and earth, designed to endure for centuries. A military victory could be forgotten or rewritten in tales, but a palace standing atop a sacred ruin made the conquest undeniable, a fact you lived with every single day. The victory was no longer an event in the past. It was your present reality, the very ground beneath the ruler's throne and, by extension, beneath your feet. It communicated a complete narrative of power without uttering a single word. The message was one of total absorption. Your sacred past does not lie beside my present. It has been buried by it, repurposed to support my glory. This act transformed the spiritual energy of the place, the genius Loci, into a captive audience for the emperor's performance of legitimacy. Where people once gathered to honor their ancestors, they now gathered to pay taxes to the emperor's administrators. The continuity of the site's importance was maintained, but its meaning was forcibly rewritten. This created a powerful, if painful, link for the conquered population. Their most sacred ground was still the center of the world, but it was a center now controlled by another. This often served to disorient and demoralize resistance, anchoring the new order in the very geography of the old identity. A famous example lies in the heart of Rome itself. The Grand Basilica of St. Peter, the spiritual center of the Catholic world, was deliberately built over the Circus of Nero, a site associated with a period of hardship for early Christians. This was not a random choice of land. It was a profound symbolic statement. A place once connected with struggle was transformed into the ultimate monument to faith's triumph. The new structure did not ignore the past. It declared victory over it, using the historical weight of the location to cement a new legacy. This is the enduring power of building over sacred ruins. It turns memory into a monument and conquest into a permanent feature of the horizon. But to make this strategy work, emperors needed more than just stone. They required a story, a way to justify this profound act of spiritual and cultural takeover to both the conquered and their own followers. How did they frame this architectural domination as something necessary, even divinely ordained? Rome offers one of history's clearest blueprints for this strategy. High above the bustling forum, the Palatine Hill rises as a quiet, green island in the modern city. But 2,000 years ago, this was not a park. It was the ultimate address, the seat of imperial power where emperors from Augustus to Domitian built their sprawling palace complexes. The very word palace derives from Palatine, a testament to its enduring symbolic weight. Yet the choice of this specific hill was not merely for its fine views or defensive position. The first emperors built their homes directly atop the most sacred ground in all of Roman mythology, the legendary site where Romulus was said to have founded the city. By the time Augustus came to power, the Palatine was already layered with ancient memory. At its summit stood the temple of Magna Mater, the Great Mother, a goddess brought to Rome in a time of crisis. Nearby were the remains of sacred huts, structures venerated as the original dwellings of Romulus and his companions. These were not grand monuments, but humble, hallowed markers of the city's origin story. When Augustus decided to build his residence there, he was making a calculated, profound statement. He was not just building a house, he was physically inserting himself and his new imperial office into the foundational myth of Rome. His palace walls literally enclosed and stood upon the ruins associated with the city's first king. This architectural move performed a silent but brilliant piece of political alchemy. It transformed the narrative of the Republic, which had just ended in civil war, into a prelude for the empire. Augustus became not a dictator who destroyed the old ways, but a new Romulus, a second founder restoring order from his home on the very hill where the city began. The genius loci of the Palatine, its spirit of foundation and divine favor, was now channeled directly into the person of the emperor. Every senator who climbed the hill to meet with Augustus walked past those ancient, preserved huts, receiving a subconscious lesson in continuity. The message in stone was undeniable. The emperor's authority was as natural and as rooted in Roman soil as the legend of Romulus itself. Later emperors expanded this concept dramatically. Domitian's vast Flavian palace, a complex so large it defined the word palace for centuries, didn't shy away from these sacred spots. It consumed them, weaving them into its very floor plan. To walk its marbled halls was to walk over the bedrock of Roman identity, now serving as the foundation for imperial spectacle. This was the ultimate act of cultural capture. The private home of the emperor and the public heart of Roman myth became one and the same place. The past was not discarded. It was entombed with honor, its power harvested to illuminate the present ruler. But Rome was not alone in this practice. A similar, yet even more dramatic story of architectural dominance was unfolding on the other side of the world, where an empire arose not from hills but from the clouds. Across the Pacific Ocean, an empire conceived a different but equally powerful logic for building upon the past. In Beijing, the Forbidden City stands as a masterpiece of cosmic order, its sweeping roofs and vast courtyards arranged with meticulous precision. Yet its foundations hold a secret. The Ming dynasty emperors who built this celestial capital in the early 1500s did not choose an empty plain. They built their palace directly over the raised remnants of the Yuan dynasty's imperial center, the dynasty established by Kublai Khan's Mongol successors. This was not mere urban renewal. It was a calculated act of spiritual and energetic warfare, fought with compasses and construction crews. In the Chinese worldview, the land was alive with a vital force called Kai, a breath-like energy that flowed through mountains, rivers, and human-made structures. The placement of a home, let alone an emperor's palace, was a matter of supreme importance governed by the principles of Feng Shui, the art of harmonizing with these invisible currents. A site with strong, auspicious Kai was believed to bring prosperity, stability, and divine favor. The old Yuan palaces, by their very existence, had gathered and shaped the Kai of that location for nearly a century. To simply abandon that site would leave a powerful, rival energy node intact, a potential source of instability or a focus for lingering loyalties. The Ming solution was one of brilliant, assertive alchemy. They dismantled the Mongol palaces, but they did not flee from the land's history. Instead, they sought to master it by building their own, far grander complex atop the exact same axis. They aimed to neutralize the old Kai and overwrite it with their own. They were capturing the most auspicious site in the region, but also fundamentally reprogramming its energy to support the new mandate of heaven. The Forbidden City's layout is a map of the cosmos, with the emperor's throne at the precise center of the world, aligning with the pole star. Every gate, every hall, every color was a deliberate choice to attract and cultivate benevolent forces. Building this perfect geometric order upon the foundations of the defeated Mongols sent an unmistakable message. The chaotic energy of the past had been subdued and reorganized into a new, perfect harmony under the Ming. The mandate of heaven had not just changed hands. It had been physically anchored into the earth at its most potent point. This practice continued centuries later with the Qing dynasty, who themselves were originally from beyond the Great Wall. After taking power, they did not destroy the Forbidden City. They moved into it, wisely adopting its immense cosmological power as their own. But they also expanded the language of dominance in their summer retreat, the Yuanming Yuan, or Garden of Perfect Brightness. This vast complex of palaces and gardens was built northwest of the city, and historical accounts suggest parts of it were constructed over the sites of older Ming-era gardens and temples. This was more than enjoying a nice view. It was a subtle continuation of the cycle, a way for the new Manchu rulers to gently assert their control over the landscape's layered history, cultivating their own legitimacy by carefully managing the legacy embedded in the land. The goal was always the same from Rome to Beijing: to harness the past, not erase it, to take the spiritual and symbolic capital of a place and convert it into a foundation for unchallengeable authority. But what happens when this strategy is taken to its most extreme, most literal conclusion? What does it mean when an emperor does not just build over sacred ground, but constructs his entire identity, his own divine right to rule, from the physical remains of his predecessors? The answer lies in a city of gold high in the clouds. The conquest of Tenochtitlan was not just a military defeat. It was an act of profound spiritual and architectural erasure. In 1521, when Hernán Cortés and his allies finally breached the heart of the Aztec capital, they stood before the Templo Mayor, the Great Temple. This was not merely a pyramid. It was the axis of the Aztec universe, a dual shrine to the god of war, Huitzilopochtli, and the rain god, Tlaloc. Here, the energy of the sun was believed to be sustained, and the very balance of the cosmos maintained. To the Spanish, this was the pinnacle of what they had come to dismantle. Their strategy for victory extended far beyond the battlefield. To truly conquer a civilization, you had to conquer its sacred geography. The Spanish did not just topple the Templo Mayor, they methodically dismantled it stone by sacred stone, and used those very stones to build a new world upon its bones. The main plaza of the Aztec capital, the ceremonial center of an empire, was chosen as the foundation for the new colonial city's most powerful institutions. The great cathedral rose where the main temple once stood. The viceregal palace, the seat of Spanish political power, was constructed alongside it. This was a meticulously planned demonstration of total replacement. One world order was not merely defeated. It was physically buried, and a new one was constructed from its rubble. The message was unambiguous and meant for every surviving inhabitant to internalize daily. Your gods are gone, their house is now our house, your political center now serves our king. The genius Loci, the powerful spiritual energy that made this site the center of the Aztec world, was to be captured and converted. The Spanish believed they were not just building on land, but on a spiritual battleground, consecrating a pagan site for the Christian god. This act transformed the landscape into a permanent lesson in power. Every indigenous person who walked across the Zocalo, the new main square, would feel the weight of that history beneath their feet. They were literally walking over the heart of their old world, now capped by the symbols of the new. This created a brutal continuity of place that severed continuity of meaning. The site remained the most important location in the city, but its importance now flowed from a completely different source. It was a masterstroke of psychological domination, ensuring the conquest was not a memory but a lived environment. The stones that once echoed with chants to Huitzilopochtli now formed the walls where Mass was held for Saint Joseph. The strategy aimed to break the chain of memory by occupying its very anchor point. Yet, in a twist of historical irony, this act of attempted erasure also preserved the past. For centuries, the true scale and grandeur of the Templo Mayor lay forgotten, buried directly beneath the bustling center of Mexico City. It was not until the late 1970s, when utility workers stumbled upon a massive stone disk depicting the dismembered moon goddess Coyolxauhqui, that the ancient temple began to re-emerge. The archaeological excavation that followed revealed the layered truth literally beneath the cathedral. The Spanish had built upon the Aztec temple, but the Aztecs themselves had built upon earlier temples, each new layer encapsulating the one before in a sacred tradition of renewal and power. The Spanish conquest, in its ruthless efficiency, had simply become the latest layer in that deep history. Today, the excavated ruins of the Templo sit in stark, silent dialogue with the metropolitan cathedral beside it. This juxtaposition makes the conquest strategy visible in a way no history book ever could. It shows not a clean break but a violent overlay, one world you physically imposed upon another. The site no longer speaks of pure erasure but of a painful, palpable palimpsest where the past refuses to be completely silenced. This case reveals the ultimate ambition and the inherent risk of the strategy. By building on sacred ruins, an emperor or a conqueror seeks to finalize history, to end the old story and write a new one from its concluding page. But the earth has a long memory. The foundational energy they sought to capture can sometimes whisper back through the stones, reminding us that power is rarely as permanent as the monuments built to proclaim it. This leads us to a final, crucial question. If capturing sacred ground was so vital for legitimacy, what happened when this blueprint was ignored? What fate awaited the ruler who built his glorious palace on spiritually neutral but practically perfect ground? This architectural conquest finds its ultimate expression in a chilling Roman practice, the Damnatio Memoriae, the condemnation of memory. When the Senate declared this against a fallen emperor, his statues were toppled, his name chiseled from inscriptions, his image scraped from coins. It was an attempt to purge him from history, but stone can be recarved and bronze melted down. A more profound, more permanent form of damnatio memoriae was not to erase a man's image, but to erase a god's home. Building a palace over a sacred ruin was this concept applied to an entire belief system. It aimed not just at a person's legacy, but at the spiritual footprint of a people, seeking to obliterate it from the very landscape of collective consciousness. Destroying a temple leaves a vacant lot, a space where memory can gather and perhaps even rebuild. But capping that sacred ground with the conqueror's own seat of power does something far more insidious. It actively fills the void. It redirects the flow of human traffic, devotion, and daily life. Where people once came to mourn their old gods, they now come to pay homage to a new king. The site's profound importance is maintained, but its meaning is forcibly rewired. This transforms memory from a potential seed of rebellion into a foundation stone for the new order. The old stories are not just forgotten, they are buried under a new, louder, more demanding narrative written in marble and gold. It is a psychological enclosure of the past. Think of it as building a fortress directly over a sacred spring. You haven't destroyed the water source. You have simply placed it under your direct control, deciding who may access it and for what purpose. The spiritual energy, the genius loci, is not annihilated. It is captured and placed in service to a new master. This makes the conquest incredibly difficult to reverse. How do you resurrect a temple when it lies buried beneath 100,000 tons of imperial palace? The act physically seals the old world in a tomb of the new one. For the conquered population, this creates a disorienting, daily dissonance. Their most potent place of memory is still there, but they can no longer touch it, no longer use it to connect with their ancestors or their gods in the old way. It has been taken off the mental map of their identity and placed on the administrative map of the empire. This form of damnatio memoriae is so complete because it attacks the future as much as the past. It doesn't just try to make people forget what was. It actively constructs a new reality that makes remembering almost physically painful, a reminder of loss every time you glance at the emperor's towering walls. The sacred ruin, once a source of strength and continuity, is transformed into a permanent monument to its own subjugation. This reveals the true ambition behind the strategy. It was never merely about practical land use or even simple propaganda. It was an attempt to win the war of time itself, to ensure that the past could never again be a viable alternative to the present they had built. But history, like a river diverted, has a tendency to find its old courses. What happens when the dam of Imperial stone finally cracks, when the buried past begins to whisper not just to the conquered, but to the conqueror's own descendants? A tempting explanation for this pattern is simple pragmatism. After all, prime ceremonial land was often flat, well-drained, and centrally located. And why waste perfectly good stone from a toppled temple when you could reuse it? This logic of convenience seems compelling on the surface, yet the historical record consistently tells a more expensive, more deliberate story. Rulers did not just settle for these sites because they were easy. They frequently went to extraordinary lengths, incurring immense cost and logistical hardship, to build precisely where sacred ruins stood, even when untouched, more practical land was readily available. This was not resource management, it was a calculated investment in symbolic capital. Consider the sheer physics of the task. Building a monumental palace is a staggering undertaking. To first demolish an existing stone pyramid or temple complex, clear away the rubble, and then begin your own foundation work is exponentially more difficult than starting on a clean, stable plot. It requires more labor, more time, and far more coordination. If the goal were merely efficient reuse of materials, a conqueror could simply quarry the old stones, transport them a short distance to a new, easier site, and build there. But that is not what happened. The sacred geography itself was the non-negotiable target. The act of building directly on top was the entire point. The effort itself became part of the performance of power. A ruler willing to move mountains of sacred debris to plant his flag sent an unmistakable message about his resources and his resolve. This is vividly illustrated by the Spanish in Mexico City. The marshy ground of Lake Texcoco was a nightmare for large stone foundations. The conquistadors and their indigenous laborers faced constant flooding and instability. They could have chosen the firmer hills surrounding the valley. Instead, they doubled down on difficulty, driving thousands of wooden piles into the soft earth beneath the ruins of the Templo Mayor to support their colossal cathedral. This was a brutal, decades-long engineering struggle. They chose the hardest possible path because the symbolic victory of occupying that exact footprint was worth any cost. Similarly, when Roman emperors built their palaces on the crowded, uneven Palatine Hill, they dealt with ancient structures, cramped space, and complex land ownership. They could have developed the wider, flatter Campus Martius area with far less hassle, but the Palatine's mythic weight made the inconvenience irrelevant. The expense of engineering terraces and weaving new construction around hallowed huts was a feature, not a bug. It proved the emperor's power to reshape even the most revered landscape to his will. This pattern holds across cultures. In Cusco, Peru, the Inca often built their most important temples and palaces over the sacred huacas, or shrines of conquered peoples. They didn't just reuse the sites, they frequently built with even finer masonry, a more demanding style of construction, to physically demonstrate the superiority of their order over the older, rougher stonework beneath. The greater effort underscored the greater legitimacy. The pragmatic argument also stumbles on a key emotional point. For a conquered population, seeing their most sacred stones reused as mere foundation filler or street paving was not a neutral act of recycling. It was a profound insult, a deliberate humiliation of the materials they once revered. This often inflamed resentment, making governance harder, not easier. A pragmatic ruler seeking a quiet life would avoid such provocative acts, but an emperor crafting a theology of total victory needed that provocation. He needed every citizen to understand on a visceral level that the old world was now literally beneath the new one. The reused stone was a relic put to menial work. So, while saved resources were a welcome side effect, they were never the primary motive. The motive was alchemical. It was the belief that by consuming the sacred past physically, you could metabolize its power spiritually. The immense cost and effort were the price of admission to a deeper game, one where legitimacy was mined from the bedrock of history itself. This reveals the strategy as a conscious, high-stakes gamble. But such gambles can have unintended consequences. What happens when the spiritual energy you tried to capture refuses to be tamed, when the past, buried under your palace, begins to assert a power of its own? The immense stone foundations of these palaces held more than just weight. They contained secrets. Before the first grand column was raised or the first marble floor laid, ancient builders often performed a final, crucial act. They buried objects deep within the earth upon which the palace would stand. These were not accidental losses. They were deliberate ritual deposits placed with solemn intention into the very fabric of the new building. Archaeologists have found them across the world, from Mesopotamian foundation boxes containing inscribed tablets to Chinese bronze mirrors and jade discs buried at palace corners. At first glance, these seem like simple acts of blessing, a way to ask the gods for protection and stability for the new structure. But when we view them in the context of building over sacred ruins, their meaning deepens and darkens considerably. These rituals were not just about inviting benevolent forces. They were about managing dangerous ones. They were a spiritual containment strategy. The conqueror understood that the genius loci of the conquered site, that accumulated spiritual energy, did not simply vanish when the old temple was torn down. It remained a potent and potentially rebellious force trapped beneath the new order. The ritual deposit served as a kind of metaphysical anchor, a way to pin down, subdue, and redirect that latent power. Think of it as a spiritual lightning rod. By burying specific, powerful objects, often items from the conqueror's own religious tradition or symbolic representations of his authority, the builders were attempting to ground the old energy. They were channeling it, forcing it to flow in a new direction that supported the palace above rather than undermining it. In Mesopotamia, foundation deposits frequently included figurines of protective deities or kings, their images facing downward as if to guard against and watch over the chthonic forces below. The message inscribed on accompanying tablets was not merely a dedication. It was a declaration of ownership over the very soil and its history. The act transformed the foundation trench from a construction detail into a ceremonial grave for the old world's autonomous spirit, burying it with tokens of the new regime. In China, the burial of jade discs, symbols of heaven and imperial virtue, at cardinal points around a palace was a feng shui practice of the highest order. It was believed to harmonize and regulate the Kai of the location, ensuring that any chaotic or residual energies from the previous dynasty were calmed and integrated into the cosmic order of the new one. The palace did not just sit on the land. It actively performed geomancy upon it, using ritual deposits as tuning instruments to adjust the site's spiritual frequency. This practice reveals a fascinating layer of anxiety beneath the boldness of imperial power. The conqueror, for all his proclaimed dominance, often acted as if the ground itself could revolt. The ceremonial rites were a form of spiritual diplomacy mixed with intimidation, addressing the invisible inhabitants of the place directly. Through ritual, the builders communicated a new treaty. The old forces could remain, but henceforth they would serve as protectors of the new palace, bound by the sacred objects now buried within their domain. This completed the cycle of capture. First, the physical structure of the old sacred site was demolished. Then, the new palace was built over its footprint, containing it architecturally. Finally, through foundation deposits, its spiritual essence was ceremonially bound and repurposed. The conquest was thus made total, reaching from the visible world of stone down into the invisible world of belief. The palace became more than a building. It became a sealed unit of power with its glittering halls above and its ritually charged foundations below, forever holding the past in a state of controlled, productive captivity. But what was the ultimate goal of this profound, layered effort? If capturing sacred ground was about legitimacy and binding its spirit was about security, what final prize were these emperors truly seeking to secure with their silent, stone-language proclamations? This final layer of the strategy reveals its most brilliant and deceptive move. After physically demonstrating total dominance, the emperor performed a stunning rhetorical pivot. He stopped speaking as a conqueror and began speaking as a custodian. The palace, built upon the sacred ruins of a vanquished culture, became the central prop in a grand historical forgery. The ruler who had just obliterated a temple now presented himself not as its destroyer, but as its rightful heir, the legitimate restorer of a glorious tradition he claimed had been lost or corrupted. This was the ultimate act of political alchemy, transforming violent conquest into benevolent succession. How could such a contradiction be sold to the people? The answer lies in the silent, undeniable evidence of the palace itself. Its location was the proof. By building his seat of power on that exact, hallowed ground, the emperor wove himself into the fabric of the land's memory. He created an unbroken visual lineage. He could point to the stones beneath his throne and declare, "This has always been the place of power. I have not taken it from you. I have returned it to its proper purpose with me as its guardian." The act of building over the ruins became, in his telling, an act of preservation and renewal. He framed the demolition not as erasure, but as a necessary clearing away of decay to reveal a purer, original truth, a truth that conveniently justified his own rule. This narrative was powerfully seductive, even to some of the conquered. It offered a thread of continuity in a shattered world. Instead of facing the brutal reality of total cultural loss, they were offered a story that allowed them to keep their sacred geography, albeit with a new landlord. Their ancestors were still honored in a way because the site was still honored. Their gods might even be quietly absorbed into the new pantheon, given new names but similar attributes. This process, known as syncretism, was a masterstroke of soft power. The Roman Empire was particularly adept at this. When they conquered a territory, they rarely denied the existence of local gods. Instead, they would often build a temple to the Roman equivalent Jupiter for a sky god, Mars for a war god right beside or even incorporating the older sacred site. The emperor, as the chief priest of the Roman state religion, positioned himself as the unifying figure who could communicate with all these gods on behalf of the empire. He became the indispensable link between the old local spirits and the new imperial order. His palace, often containing shrines to these synthesized deities, stood as the headquarters of this spiritual diplomacy. He wasn't destroying your past, he was giving it a prestigious new home within his global project. We see a similar logic in the way Chinese dynasties handled the mandate of heaven. A new dynasty, which often came to power through rebellion or invasion, would claim it had received the mandate because the previous rulers had lost the virtue necessary to hold it. Their moral corruption had caused natural disasters and suffering. The conquering emperor's first duty, then, was to restore harmony. Building his capital and palace upon the old sacred centers was part of that restoration. He was cleansing the site of its failed energy and recalibrating it for a new cycle of prosperity. He was the doctor, not the murderer of the state. This narrative turned the act of building over ruins into a public service, a cosmic correction. Even the Spanish in the Americas employed a version of this. While their methods were far more brutal, their official ideology often framed the conquest as a spiritual rescue. They claimed to be saving indigenous souls from error. Building a cathedral directly atop the Templo was, in their theology, an act of healing, replacing a site of darkness with one of light. They positioned themselves as the bearers of a truer, older faith, Christianity, that had now finally reached these lost lands. In each case, the architecture enforced the story. The palace or cathedral didn't just sit on the land. It performed a continuous, silent argument. every day, its presence said, "This is the natural order. This is where power has always resided, and I am its current, legitimate expression." The violent rupture of conquest was smoothed over into a seamless transition. The emperor became the curator of history, selectively editing the past to make his present rule inevitable. This fabrication of lineage was the final, masterful step in securing not just territory but time itself. It aimed to make the empire feel eternal, not new, and in doing so, it confronted every subject with a haunting, unanswerable question. If the past can be so thoroughly rewritten in stone, how can we ever be sure we know where the story truly began? The most profound power an emperor could claim was not over land but over time itself, and to command time you had to command the sky. For many ancient cultures, sacred sites were not just spiritual centers. They were cosmic clocks. Their alignments marked the solstices, tracked the stars, and connected the rhythm of human life to the grand, unchangeable cycle of the heavens. When a new ruler built his palace over such a place, he faced a critical choice. He could erase these celestial alignments or he could steal them. The most cunning emperors chose the latter. They didn't just build on the sacred ground. They meticulously co-opted its astronomical blueprint, recalibrating the ancient stones to tie their own authority to the same immutable cosmic order. This was the ultimate act of legitimization, linking a mortal king's rule to the eternal mechanics of the universe. Think of a sacred site as a permanent sundial. A temple doorway might be positioned so the rising sun on the summer solstice poured directly down the central aisle, illuminating the statue of a god. A standing stone might cast a shadow that touched a specific marker only on the winter solstice. These alignments were a form of divine communication, proof that the site was in harmony with the cosmos. For a conqueror, this presented a tantalizing opportunity. Destroying the temple might anger the gods of that place, but capturing its celestial function. That would prove the gods had switched their allegiance. The new palace would become the new receiver of that cosmic signal. The emperor wasn't interrupting the conversation between heaven and earth. He was simply inserting himself as the new, privileged interlocutor. We can see this celestial strategy at work in numerous empires. In Egypt, the pharaohs were living gods whose power was intrinsically tied to the sun god Ra. The alignment of temples and pyramids to cardinal directions and specific stars was a sacred science. When a new dynasty rose, they often built their mortuary temples in proximity to older, venerated complexes, carefully aligning them to the same solar events. This created a visual and symbolic lineage, suggesting their reign was a continuation of a divine pattern established at the dawn of time. Their authority was written not just in hieroglyphs, but in the path of the sun across their courtyards. A particularly clear example comes from the Inca Empire. The Coricancha, or Temple of the Sun, in Cusco was the most sacred site in the Inca world. It was a masterpiece of celestial engineering. Windows and niches were aligned so that sunlight and moonlight would strike specific golden ornaments during equinoxes and solstices. The entire city of Cusco was laid out in the shape of a puma, with the Coricancha at its heart, and its major sight lines extended to sacred huacas on the horizon that marked solar and lunar events. When the Inca conquered a new region, they would often identify the local population's most important solar observation point. Rather than destroy it, they would frequently build their own administrative center or temple nearby, incorporating that existing alignment into their own, more complex imperial calendar. They were demonstrating a superior understanding of the very cosmos the locals revered. The message was, your sacred calendar is a provincial dialect. We speak the language of the heavens fluently, and we will now teach it to you from this new center we control. This recalibration of sacred axes was a silent, brilliant propaganda. By building his palace on the same axis as an older temple, but perhaps making it grander or adjusting it slightly to highlight a different star associated with his own patron deity. An emperor performed a subtle rewrite of cosmic history. He was saying, "The universe has always been pointing to this moment, to my reign. You were just reading the map incorrectly until I arrived to show you the true destination." The solstice sun didn't just rise, it rose for him, flooding his throne room with light in a spectacular annual reaffirmation of his divine right. This practice transformed the palace from a political building into an instrument of astronomy, a machine for manufacturing legitimacy with every passing season. The king became a solar king, his power rhythmically renewed by the heavens themselves, all because he had the foresight to build his house upon the old world's observatory. But capturing the sky was only one part of the equation. To complete the illusion of eternal, natural rule, these emperors needed to perform one final, breathtaking act of historical theater. They needed to stage a ceremony that would make the past itself bow to the present. Water was the lifeblood of ancient civilization, and its source was often considered divine. To control a sacred spring was to hold the throat of a kingdom. Emperors understood this with visceral clarity, and their palace placements reveal a chillingly pragmatic dimension to their spiritual conquests. Beyond capturing celestial alignments, they sought to command the very wellsprings of life, the underground rivers and holy springs that fed both the land and the faith of its people. A palace built over such a source didn't just occupy sacred ground. It performed a continuous, silent act of hydraulic control, merging spiritual authority with absolute command over survival itself. Across the ancient world, water sources were rarely just practical amenities. They were portals to the underworld, gifts from rain gods, the dwelling places of nymphs or dragon kings. The ceremonies performed at these sites were not mere rituals. They were essential technologies for ensuring fertility, predicting floods, and guaranteeing the harvest. The priesthood that managed these ceremonies held immense social power because they mediated between the community and the elemental force it could not live without. When a new emperor arrived, this existing power structure posed a direct threat. He could not allow a rival source of authority, based on such a critical resource, to operate independently of his throne. The solution was architectural enclosure. By constructing his palace complex directly over or adjacent to a sacred spring, the emperor physically absorbed its management. The grotto where local priests once chanted to water deities became a private, ornamented fountain within the royal gardens. The ceremony to bless the planting season was moved from the public riverbank to the courtyard of the imperial residence, now presided over by the emperor or his appointed high priest. This was more than a change of venue. It was a fundamental rerouting of spiritual and practical power. The message to the populace was stark and inescapable. The God who gives you water now speaks through me. Your harvest depends on my favor, not the old local rites. A powerful example emerges from the Hittite Empire in ancient Anatolia, at their capital of Hattusa. The city was built around a number of sacred springs and underground water systems, which were integral to both survival and religious practice. The great temple, dedicated to the storm god, was situated near these vital water sources. Later, when the Hittite kings expanded their royal citadel, they carefully integrated these hydrological and sacred features into the fortified palace complex. They didn't destroy the springs, they brought them inside the walls, turning a public, communal sacred resource into a controlled, royal one. The fertility and purification ceremonies associated with the water were now state ceremonies, reinforcing the king's role as the chief intermediary with the gods who controlled the rain and the rivers. This pattern repeats in the classical world. In Rome, the Palatine Hill, home to the imperial palaces, was not chosen for its sweeping views alone. It was also the site of ancient, venerated springs. The Lupercal, the cave where the she-wolf was said to have suckled Romulus and Remus, was believed to be a spring sanctuary. By building his residence atop the Palatine, Augustus didn't just tap into the myth of Romulus. He also positioned his household as the guardian of Rome's primordial, life-giving waters. Control of the city's monumental aqueducts was a public marvel, but control of its foundational springs was a sacred, private privilege of the emperor. Perhaps the most vivid illustration is found in the Inca Empire at Machu Picchu. The entire citadel is a masterpiece of hydraulic engineering, but its spiritual heart is a series of ceremonial fountains fed by a natural spring on the mountainside. This spring was almost certainly a sacred huaca long before the Inca built their retreat. The stonework that channels the water is of the finest quality, and the path of the water flows through the Temple of the Sun and other important structures before reaching the agricultural terraces. Here, the connection is beautifully explicit. The Inca emperor, by building his estate around this spring, demonstrated a total, graceful dominion. He captured the sacred water source, showcased his engineers' ability to enhance its flow with breathtaking stonework, and then used that water to nourish both the spiritual ceremonies in the temples and the practical needs of the gardens. He became the source of both fertility and faith, with the gentle, constant sound of flowing water throughout the palace serving as an audible reminder of his benevolent control. This strategy of hydraulic control completed the circle of imperial domination. It moved beyond symbols and stories to grip the most tangible requirement of life. By placing his palace over the sacred spring, the emperor didn't just claim to speak for the water deity. He literally held the tap. He could present himself as the generous provider, the bringer of fertility and abundance. Yet the underlying reality was one of absolute leverage. The old local cult, whose identity was woven around the guardian of the spring, found its purpose usurped. Their sacred site was now a royal water feature. Their ceremonies were now court rituals. The genius loci of the place, its spirit, was not banished. It was put to work, its life-giving energy now flowing in channels designed by and for the new ruler. This fusion of spiritual capture and resource control created an authority that was both deeply mystical and brutally practical, an authority that could quench a kingdom's thirst as easily as it could command its obedience. But this architectural strategy left behind a hidden archive, sealed beneath the marble floors. Modern archaeology has peeled back the layers of these imperial foundations to reveal a startling truth. Often, the sacred ruins were not violently pulverized into dust. Instead, they were carefully, almost reverently, buried intact. The old temple walls, the sacred spring stone lining, the ancient altar, they were not erased. They were entombed. This discovery changes everything. It suggests the conqueror's goal was not simple obliteration, but a form of spiritual containment. The old power was to be sealed within a new, controlling structure, its energy preserved but imprisoned, like a relic placed in a sanctified vault beneath the throne. The sacred past became a permanent part of the palace's substructure, a captured power source wired directly into the foundations of the new regime. A profound example of this comes from Rome, beneath the Flavian palace of Emperor Domitian on the Palatine Hill. Excavations have revealed that the builders did not level everything. They encountered the sacred Casa Romuli, the hut of Romulus, a small, ancient structure venerated as the dwelling place of the city's mythical founder. This hut was a potent symbol, a direct link to Rome's humble, heroic origins. Domitian's architects did not destroy it, they built around it. They incorporated its site into the sprawling new palace complex, effectively placing the imperial residence in a direct, physical dialogue with this foundational relic. The hut was not removed, it was curated, made a controlled exhibit within the emperor's home. This was not preservation out of sentiment, it was a calculated display of ownership. By keeping the hut intact but subsumed within his palace, Domitian demonstrated that even the most sacred origin point of Roman identity was now a protected artifact under his custodianship. The genius of Romulus was now a guest in the house of Domitian. We see a parallel practice in the Andes. The Inca were masters of this incorporative technique. When they conquered a people, they would often build their own finely fitted stone walls directly onto and around the existing, rougher masonry of the local shrine or palace. The old structure was not demolished. It was encased like a fossil set within a new, more impressive stone matrix. At sites like Sacsayhuaman above Cusco, you can see this clearly, the older, smaller stones of a vanquished culture literally supporting the bottom courses of the monumental, precisely cut Inca walls above. This was a physical metaphor for the new imperial order. The past was not gone. It was now the load-bearing foundation for a grander present. The energy and labor of the conquered people, embodied in their sacred architecture, were literally supporting the weight of Inca supremacy. This deliberate burial reveals a nuanced understanding of power. Total erasure risked creating a spiritual vacuum, a haunted space that might breed resentment or instability. But careful public entombment achieved multiple goals. It showed respect, however calculated, which could soften the blow of conquest. It created a tangible lineage, allowing the new ruler to claim, "I have not destroyed your history. I have built upon it." Most importantly, it allowed the emperor to harness the perceived potency of the site. The sacred ruin, preserved in the dark earth beneath the palace, functioned like a spiritual capacitor. Its power was contained, prevented from dissipating or rallying the old faithful, and was instead channeled upward to stabilize and legitimize the new construction above. The old gods were not killed. They were put under house arrest, their influence redirected to serve a new master. This transforms our understanding of these palaces from mere buildings into complex psychological devices. They were layered constructions with a public face of glorious modernity and a hidden, foundational layer of captured history. The emperor could walk his sunlit courtyards, confident that beneath his feet, the very bedrock of the old world was securely held, its power neutered and repurposed. It was the ultimate act of archival control, keeping the past on file, but under lock and key deep in the palace basement. So, if the sacred past could be so meticulously buried and contained, what happened when an emperor faced a past that was not made of stone but of story? When the ruins he needed to build upon were not physical, but existed only in the memory and myth of the people he sought to rule. Yet this profound act of spiritual engineering was never without its critics or its perceived dangers. For every emperor who believed he had captured and tamed the genius Loci, there were whispers in the shadows, stories passed among the common people and even the elite that suggested he had instead provoked it. Across cultures, a persistent counter-narrative emerged in folklore and historical accounts, one that framed the building over sacred grounds not as a masterstroke, but as a perilous gamble with fate itself. These tales of curses, misfortune, and dynastic collapse reveal that contemporaries understood the profound spiritual risk involved. To them, the Earth's memory was not a resource to be mined, but a living force to be respected, and its violation could invite a terrible reckoning. In ancient Rome, the practice was so common it spawned its own cautionary tales. The historian Livy recounts the story of King Tarquinius Superbus, the last monarch of Rome, who sought to build a grand temple to Jupiter on the Tarpeian rock. To do so, he had to clear numerous shrines and altars dedicated to other gods. When the augurs, the official diviners, consulted the will of the gods, the signs were ominously negative for removing the shrine of the god Terminus, the deity of boundaries. They interpreted this as a divine refusal to be moved. Rather than heed the warning, Tarquinius had the shrine incorporated into the new temple's foundation. While this was later spun as a positive omen of Rome's immovable boundaries, the underlying folk memory carried a darker tone. The king's disregard for sacred boundaries was part of a pattern of arrogance that led to his violent overthrow and the establishment of the Republic. The story served as a lesson. Even when you physically contain a god's shrine, you cannot force its blessing. Perhaps the most famous example of this perceived backlash is the biblical account of Jericho. According to the book of Joshua, after the city's walls fell, Joshua pronounced a solemn oath or curse upon anyone who would dare rebuild it. The curse specified that the refounder would do so at the cost of his firstborn son, and his youngest son would perish when the gates were set in place. Centuries later, during the reign of King Ahab, a man named Hiel of Bethel chose to rebuild Jericho. The biblical text starkly records the outcome. As he laid its foundations, his firstborn son Abiram passed, and as he set up its gates, his youngest son Segub passed. This story, whether read as history or powerful folklore, perfectly encapsulates the ancient belief in the enduring potency of a sacred curse tied to a specific place. Rebuilding on a site of divinely ordained destruction was not urban development. It was an act of hubris that invited a direct, tragic consequence. The ground itself remembered its sentence. This theme of the earth fighting back appears in the legends of many lands. In Irish mythology, the kings of Tara, the sacred seat of the high kings, were bound by a multitude of geasa, or sacred prohibitions. Many of these taboos were tied to the land and its specific features. Violating a jays was believed to inevitably lead to the king's loss of sovereignty and his death. The stories imply that the king's right to rule was a fragile contract with the spirit of the land itself, a contract that could be voided by a single act of disrespect toward a sacred hill, tree, or well. To build a palace was to enter into this contract. To build it over a revered site without proper propitiation was to risk breaching it from the very first stone. Even in China, where the cosmological system of Feng Shui was used to harmonize and control earthly energies, there was an understanding that these forces could rebel if mismanaged. Historical records and popular tales sometimes attributed the fall of a dynasty to poor geomancy or the violation of a previous dynasty's burial grounds. While an emperor might build his palace over a conquered site to capture its kai, if the rituals were insufficient or the alignment flawed, that same kai could become stagnant or vengeful, poisoning the wellspring of the dynasty's legitimacy from within. The downfall was not always seen as mere political failure, but as a cosmic correction, the land itself rejecting a ruler who failed to honor its layered history. These persistent stories are not mere superstition. They are evidence of a sophisticated cultural understanding. They represent the psychological and spiritual counterweight to imperial ambition. While the emperor broadcast a narrative of total control and seamless succession, the folklore of curses and bad luck preserved a subversive truth, that the conquest might be incomplete, that the genius Loci might not be so easily domesticated. Every strange illness in the royal household, every unexpected military defeat, every natural disaster that struck the capital could be, and often was, interpreted through this lens. Had the buried gods grown angry? Was the captured spring now bringing sickness instead of fertility? The palace, intended to be a monument to eternal stability, could thus become, in the public imagination, a haunted house, its splendid halls resting on a foundation of unresolved spiritual debt. This duality captures the ultimate tension at the heart of the strategy. The emperor sought to use the past as a foundation, but in doing so, he also made his future hostage to it. He traded the simple risks of building on new ground for the infinitely more complex risks of building over a sleeping power. The folklore of curses was the language of that risk, a reminder that the silent language of stone could sometimes have a vengeful echo. It suggests that for all their calculated brilliance, these rulers were engaged in a high-stakes dialogue with forces even they could not fully command. And sometimes the most telling response to an emperor's grand proclamation in marble is not a rival's army, but a whisper from the earth beneath his throne, a story that outlasts his dynasty and waits, patient as stone, for the archaeologists to listen. The whispering folklore of curses reveals a universal anxiety, a fear that the earth itself might reject this architectural alchemy. Yet for every cautionary tale, there were emperors who saw not risk but destiny. Nowhere is this more spectacularly demonstrated than on a windswept peninsula between two seas, where the story of a single plot of land became a thousand-year argument written in faith and marble. This is the story of the hill in Constantinople, and the breathtaking succession of sacred structures that culminated in one of history's most audacious buildings. Long before it was called Istanbul, the ancient city of Byzantium occupied a strategic point overlooking the Bosphorus. On its Acropolis, the city's highest hill, stood a temple to the Greek goddess of wisdom, Athena. This was the original sacred footprint, a place where the divine was believed to touch the earthly. When the Roman Emperor Constantine the Great rededicated the city as his new Christian capital in the 4th century, he faced the same symbolic challenge as rulers before him. He needed to plant the flag of his new faith upon the most potent ground. The pagan temple to Athena was not destroyed out of hand. Instead, it was deliberately cleared to make way for a new kind of temple, a great Christian basilica dedicated to holy wisdom, or Hagia Sophia. This first church, completed by Constantine's son Constantius II, was a powerful statement. The wisdom of the ancient goddess was being replaced, or so the builders intended, by the wisdom of the Christian God. The genius Loci of the hill was being forcefully converted, but this first attempt was fragile. That basilica burned down during a riot. Its replacement, built by Emperor Theodosius II in the early 5th century, was grander, a testament to the growing confidence and wealth of the Christian Empire. For over a century, Theodosius's church stood as the spiritual heart of Constantinople, yet it too fell victim to the city's violent passions. In the year 532, during the devastating Nika revolt, the great church was set ablaze and reduced to smoldering ruins. The hilltop was once again a blank slate, but a slate stained with the ashes of two failed attempts to permanently capture its sacred essence. This moment of crisis presented Emperor Justinian with an unparalleled opportunity. He could have chosen a new site, a safer location away from the troublesome factions of the city. Instead, he saw the smoking ruin as a divine mandate. He would not merely rebuild, he would transcend. He would construct a church so immense, so revolutionary in design, and so radiant in its glory that it would finally and permanently overwrite all memory of what had come before. He would not just capture the genius Loci, he would redefine it for all time. The project was an act of spiritual and architectural one-upmanship on a cosmic scale. Justinian's architects, Isidore of Miletus and Anthemius of Tralles, were not church builders in the traditional sense. They were mathematicians and physicists, and they were given one imperial command: create something that has never existed. The result was Hagia Sophia as we know it, a building that seems to defy the very logic of stone. Its central dome, floating on a ring of windows, appeared to be suspended from heaven by a golden chain. The interior was a cavern of light, covered in acres of gold mosaic and polished marble imported from every corner of the empire. The message was inescapable. The modest basilicas of Constantine and Theodosius were not predecessors. They were prototypes, imperfect drafts for this final, divine masterpiece. Justinian was claiming that all previous sacred energy on that hill had been merely gathering, waiting for this moment of ultimate expression under his rule. When he first entered the completed building, he is said to have exclaimed, "Solomon, I have surpassed you." He was not comparing himself to the earlier Byzantine emperors. He was comparing himself to the legendary biblical king who built the first temple in Jerusalem. Justinian was asserting that his work had ended the conversation. His church was the final, perfect word on that sacred ground, and for nearly 1,000 years it seemed he was right. Hagia Sophia stood as the seat of the Orthodox Patriarch, the crowning glory of the Byzantine Empire, a building so potent it became the archetype for all imperial church architecture. Its location was no longer just a hill. It was the unquestioned center of the Christian world in the East. The spiritual overwriting appeared total and eternal. But history, as we have seen, rarely allows a final word. In 1453, a new conqueror arrived at the walls of Constantinople, and he too understood the silent language of sacred stone. The cycle was poised to begin again, with a different faith preparing to write its own chapter over the same hallowed ground. The sacred hill in Constantinople was a story of overwriting, but its logic was perfected much earlier in the land between two rivers. In ancient Mesopotamia, the blueprint of power was not just written on the ground, but built into the sky. Here, the strategy of building over sacred ruins took its most literal and vertical form. The center of every city was the ziggurat, a colossal stepped pyramid of baked brick, often described as a mountain linking earth to heaven. At its summit stood a small temple, the literal dwelling place of the city's patron deity. This was the ultimate sacred ground, the axis of the universe for that community, and right beside it, sharing the same raised, artificial platform, stood the royal palace. This architectural pairing was no accident of urban planning. It was a deliberate theological statement in mudbrick and bitumen. By placing his palace on the same elevated terrace as the god's house, the king was physically and symbolically lifted above the ordinary plane of human existence. He did not live among his people. He lived beside his god on a man-made mountain that separated the divine precinct from the profane city below. The palace wasn't just near the temple. It was an annex to it, part of the same sacred complex. This proximity performed a continuous, silent argument for the king's authority. Every citizen looking up at the city's heart saw two structures touching the sky, the house of the god and the house of the king, who served as the god's chief steward and intermediary. The connection often went deeper than mere adjacency. In many cities like or Babylon, new palaces were frequently constructed directly over the raised foundations of older ones, which themselves had been built over even earlier sacred platforms. Each new dynasty would level the old royal quarters but would meticulously preserve and often enlarge the central ziggurat. The king's home was disposable, but the god's home was eternal. By building his new palace upon the layered remains of his predecessors' halls, the new ruler was inserting himself into an unbroken chain of divinely sanctioned authority. He was saying, the faces change, but the office endures, and it endures here on this hallowed ground, next to this eternal God. The physical elevation mirrored a social and spiritual elevation. To reach the king, ambassadors and petitioners had to climb the same processional ramps that led to the temple, moving from the flat, mundane world into the rarefied space of power. The very act of approaching the palace was a ritual of ascent, reinforcing the king's quasi-divine status with every step a visitor took. This tradition found perhaps its most famous expression in Babylon, under King Nebuchadnezzar II. His immense southern palace, with its legendary hanging gardens, was part of a vast fortified complex that included the great ziggurat Etemenanke, dedicated to the god Marduk. The palace and the ziggurat were two halves of a single cosmic engine. The king, from his lavishly decorated chambers, could look out upon the towering structure that literally supported the god's presence in the city. His authority flowed from his unique position as the one who maintained that house, who fed the god through daily rituals performed by priests, and who was therefore entrusted with governing the god's earthly estate. The palace's grandeur was not for his personal comfort alone. It was a necessary reflection of the god's glory, proof that the king was a capable manager of divine property. In Mesopotamia, to build a palace was to build a throne room in the antechamber of heaven, a permanent architectural claim to a place in the celestial order. The Inca vision of power was not confined within palace walls, but painted across the entire canvas of the Andes. For them, authority was not asserted by building over a single sacred ruin, but by becoming the master architect of a vast, living network of holy sites known as huacas. These were not man-made temples in the traditional sense. A huaca could be a strangely shaped boulder that caught the light at dawn, a spring that bubbled from a mountainside, a mountain pass with a commanding view, or even an ancient, gnarled tree. The landscape itself was sacred, dotted with these nodes of spiritual energy. The Inca emperor's genius was to weave his own centers of power directly into this pre-existing sacred web, transforming himself from a conqueror into the indispensable curator of the entire world's divine geography. At the heart of this strategy was Cusco, the navel of the Inca universe. The city was not merely built in a valley, it was designed as a reflection of the cosmos. Major sightlines called sects radiated out from the Coricancha, the temple of the sun, like spiritual ley lines. Along each sec were carefully plotted huacas, hundreds of them, forming a calendar and a map of sacred obligation. The emperor, by residing at the center of this radiating system, positioned himself as the literal and spiritual pivot point. All energy, all ritual movement, all communication with the sacred landscape flowed through him. He didn't just own the land, he managed its holiness. This concept finds its most breathtaking expression at Machu Picchu. The site is not a random collection of beautiful buildings on a ridge. It is a deliberate, sophisticated dialogue with the surrounding huacas. The entire citadel is oriented to capture celestial events. The Intihuatana, the so-called hitching post of the sun, is a carved stone pillar precisely positioned to cast no shadow at the midday sun during the equinoxes, a direct claim of alignment with the cosmos. But look beyond the architecture. The mountain behind Machu Picchu, Huayna Picchu, was itself a major huaca. The buildings were placed to frame views of other sacred peaks like the Apu or mountain spirit Salcante. Even the royal tomb area is built around a natural rock formation revered as a sacred stone. The Inca did not destroy these natural huacas, they incorporated them. They built fine stone walls that embraced the odd-shaped boulder, turning it into an altar. They channeled the sacred spring through a series of ceremonial fountains before it watered the terraces. At the site of Ollantaytambo, immense terraces and temples are built around and aligned with naturally occurring rock formations that were clearly venerated long before the Inca arrived. This practice of incorporation was a masterstroke of political and spiritual engineering. By building their administrative and royal centers in precise alignment with these huacas, the Inca performed a silent, persuasive argument. They demonstrated a superior understanding of the sacred landscape the local people already cherished. The message was, you revere this stone as a local spirit. We recognize it as part of a grand, imperial sacred system, and we will now show you its true significance from our new center of power. The emperor became the ultimate priest-king, the only one who could authorize and orchestrate the ceremonies that maintained harmony across this vast network. To control the huacas was to control the very rhythms of life, the planting seasons marked by sun shadows on specific stones, the water flow from sacred springs, the protection of the mountain spirits. By inserting his palaces and administrative complexes into this network, the emperor made his secular rule a necessary function of the cosmic order. His authority was as natural and as undeniable as the sunrise over a sacred peak. He didn't just occupy land, he curated the soul of the landscape, proving his right to rule by demonstrating he was the only one who could truly listen to what the mountains were saying. The sacred landscape of Europe was similarly rewritten, but with a different set of architects. In the rolling hills and dense forests of the early medieval world, kings found a powerful new tool for consolidating their rule, the Christian cathedral. These soaring structures of stone and glass were not merely houses of worship. For monarchs like Charlemagne or the Norman kings of England, patronizing the construction of a great cathedral on a specific, contested piece of earth was a masterful political and spiritual maneuver. It allowed them to demonstrate both Christian triumph and personal piety, weaving their own authority directly into the fabric of a newly sanctified land. The blueprint was familiar, but the materials had changed. Instead of a palace over a temple, it was a cathedral over a sacred grove. Across Europe, missionaries and monarchs identified the most potent nodes in the pagan spiritual geography. These were often natural features: a spring with healing properties, an ancient oak tree where assemblies were held, a grove dedicated to a local deity, or a hilltop used for seasonal festivals. These sites held the genius loci for entire communities. The Christian strategy, enthusiastically backed by kings seeking to unify their realms under one faith and one crown, was not to avoid these places but to confront them directly. The holy well was capped with a stone baptistry. The sacred oak was felled and its timber used to build the first church on that very spot. The ritual grove was cleared, and in its place the foundations of a cathedral were laid. This was spiritual conquest through architectural occupation, and the king, as patron, positioned himself as the agent of this divine transformation. Consider the story of Canterbury Cathedral in England. The site held deep pre-Christian significance, centered around a natural spring. When St. Augustine arrived in the late 6th century on a mission from Rome, he deliberately chose this already venerated location for his church. The existing pagan shrine was repurposed, its spiritual capital captured for the new faith. Later, after the Norman conquest, King William I and his Archbishop, Lanfranc, completely rebuilt the cathedral on a monumental scale, physically burying the older Saxon church beneath the new Norman architecture. Each layer was a statement. Augustine claimed the pagan site for Christendom. The Normans, through their colossal rebuilding, claimed the Christian site for their new royal order, demonstrating that their conquest was both military and divine. The cathedral became a permanent record of this layered victory, with the king as its patron and protector. This pattern repeats from York to Cologne. In France, numerous cathedrals like Notre Dame de Chartres are believed to have been built upon ancient Druidic groves or Gallo-Roman temples. The cathedral at Chartres sits atop a sacred well, a site of pilgrimage long before the Christian era. By building their magnificent monument to the Virgin Mary there, the church and the crown didn't erase the well's power, they baptized it. They redirected the centuries of devotion flowing to that spot toward a new Christian focal point. For a king to fund such a building was a very public act of piety, proving his commitment to God's work, but it was also a dramatic demonstration of control. He was showcasing his ability to marshal resources, command artisans, and permanently alter the most sacred geography of his kingdom in the name of a universal faith that bolstered his own universal authority. The cathedral itself became a symbol of the king's dual role. He was a spiritual son of the church and its earthly sword and treasury. His patronage made the stone sermon possible. Every time the bells rang out from the tower built over the old pagan site, they sounded a victory for Christ and for the king who had made that victory manifest in stone. The common people, living in a landscape where every hill and spring once had a pagan name and spirit, now received a daily visual lesson. The old powers were gone, subdued beneath the weight of this astonishing new building. And the man who had made it possible, the king, was therefore aligned with the new, triumphant power of heaven. His royal authority was sanctified by the very cathedral he had raised from the soil of the old world. This ecclesiastical strategy completed the circle. It proved that the impulse to build upon sacred ruins was not limited to a ruler's personal dwelling. It could be achieved even more powerfully by constructing the house of his God, thereby making his own reign a necessary part of heaven's architecture on earth. Across the Indian subcontinent, a different imperial language was written in sandstone and marble. The Mughal emperors, descendants of both Timur and Genghis Khan, arrived as conquerors from Central Asia to rule a land steeped in ancient Hindu and Jain sacred geography. To establish their dynasty as the unchallenged sovereign power, they too engaged in the silent dialogue of stone, constructing their magnificent forts and palaces upon sites of profound pre-existing significance. This was not merely a matter of selecting defensible hills or fertile riverbanks. It was a deliberate, sophisticated strategy to position Islamic authority at the very heart of the subcontinent's spiritual landscape. The most famous example, and perhaps the most contested, is the birthplace of Mughal grandeur itself, the Agra Fort. While earlier structures existed on the site, the colossal red sandstone fortress we see today was primarily built by Emperor Akbar in the late 16th century. Historical accounts and local traditions persistently suggest the fort was expanded upon land that held earlier Hindu temples. This was not an act of random demolition, but a calculated geopolitical and theological statement. By raising the seat of imperial power, a fortress containing palaces, halls of audience, and mosques upon such ground, Akbar was performing a complex act of spatial dominance. He was declaring that the highest authority in the land, both temporal and spiritual, now emanated from this new center. The fort's sheer, imposing walls did more than keep enemies out. They visually and physically encapsulated the past, rendering the old sacred geography a foundational layer in a new imperial narrative. The message to the diverse population was clear: the landscape of power had been irrevocably recalibrated. This practice found even more potent expression in the city of Delhi, the perennial seat of empires. When Shah Jahan built his new capital, Shahjahanabad, in the 17th century, he centered it on the magnificent Red Fort. The fort's location, along the banks of the Yamuna River, was strategically chosen, but its symbolism ran deeper. The area was historically part of the ancient city of Indraprastha, mentioned in the Hindu epic the Mahabharata, and was dotted with sites of older habitation and worship. Constructing the lavish Mughal palace complex here, with its flowing water channels and paradisiacal gardens, was an act of cosmic landscaping. It aimed to create a perfect Islamic vision of order and paradise, a paradise on earth, superimposed upon the storied earth of Indian legend. The fort became a microcosm of the empire, with the emperor's peacock throne as its radiant center, asserting a new axis mundi in a densely layered sacred plane. Perhaps the most illustrative and debated instances involve specific temples. Numerous Mughal-era mosques and caravanserais across South Asia carry inscriptions or architectural evidence, such as reused pillars with Hindu iconography, suggesting they were built on the foundations of or with materials from earlier temples. From a historical and political perspective, these constructions served a multifaceted purpose. For the Mughal emperor, they were tangible proclamations of victory and piety. Building a mosque, a house for the worship of the one God, was considered a meritorious act. To build it upon a site previously dedicated to other deities was to demonstrate the triumph of Islamic monotheism in a visible, permanent form. It also served a stark administrative function. These structures often became nodes in a network of imperial control places for travelers, traders, and soldiers that doubled as assertions of Mughal presence and patronage in regional towns. They physically rewrote the town's central map, placing a symbol of imperial and Islamic identity at its core. However, to view this solely through a lens of erasure is to miss a critical nuance in the Mughal strategy, particularly under certain rulers. Emperor Akbar in his later years pursued a policy of sul-i-kul, or universal peace, seeking to integrate rather than merely dominate. His construction projects, while still asserting Mughal primacy, sometimes reflected a more syncretic approach. The use of Hindu architectural motifs, the employment of Hindu craftsmen, and the incorporation of broader Indian aesthetic traditions into Mughal palaces created a blended visual language. This fusion could be interpreted as another form of mastery, not just conquering the sacred site, but also absorbing and transcending its artistic legacy, creating something new that claimed to be superior and all-encompassing. The dynamic shifted under different rulers. Aurangzeb, known for a more orthodox interpretation of Islamic law, is historically associated with a greater number of temple desecrations and the construction of mosques on disputed sites, such as the Jayanvapi Mosque in Varanasi, built alongside the Kashi Vishwanath Temple. For his supporters, these were acts of religious duty and imperial assertion. For the Hindu population, they were experienced as profound wounds in the sacred geography of their faith. These sites became literal embodiments of contested history, where every stone whispered of layered possession and loss. The resulting monuments are palimpsests in the truest sense. They are not purely Islamic or purely repurposed. They are architectural records of a complex, often painful, dialogue between conqueror and conquered, between new faith and old landscape. The very stones, with their mixed carvings and recycled pillars, tell a story of imposition, adaptation, and enduring memory. They demonstrate how the Mughal strategy of building upon sacred ruins was not a monolithic act of destruction, but a varied political tool. It could be an act of blatant supersession, a gesture of syncretic incorporation, or a demonstration of administrative control. But its core purpose remained consistent with emperors from Rome to Constantinople, to capture the genius loci of a place and redirect its accumulated spiritual and historical weight to underpin a new sovereign order. The red forts and mosque complexes did not just occupy land. They sought to settle the question of history itself, building a present so overwhelming in scale and beauty that it would persuade all who saw it of its inevitable, rightful place upon the earth. Yet, as the whispers from Agra and Delhi suggest, the earth has a long memory, and the stories embedded in its foundations have a way of resurfacing, demanding to be heard in every subsequent age. These layered sites are more than just convenient foundations. They are a deliberate form of historical record-keeping, a permanent document written not on fragile parchment, but in the heavy, enduring language of stone and earth. This is the architectural palimpsest. In the ancient world, a palimpsest was a piece of parchment where old writing was scraped away so the page could be reused for a new text. But often, traces of the original words would linger faintly beneath the surface, creating a ghostly double narrative. An emperor, by building his palace over a sacred ruin, was creating the monumental version of this. He was producing a physical, three-dimensional palimpsest, a site where the story of his conquest and the story of the vanquished culture existed in the same space, one literally supporting the other. This was not an attempt to hide the past. In many ways, it was meant to display it, to make the act of overwriting itself the central, undeniable fact of the new regime. The layered monument became a permanent, readable record of power's most profound claim, the right to edit history itself. Think of standing before a section of exposed wall in an ancient city, where rough, older stones form the base and perfectly cut, newer stones are stacked precisely on top. You are not looking at a single moment in time, you are reading a timeline. The older layer tells a story of a different people, a different technology, a different aesthetic. The newer layer announces a superior order, a more advanced civilization that did not simply ignore what came before, but chose to build directly upon it. This vertical archaeology sends a clear message about progress and succession. The emperor who commissioned that new wall was ensuring that anyone who looked at it for centuries to come would understand the narrative of replacement. The past is down here in the rough and outdated foundation. The present, my glorious present, is up here in the refined and dominant architecture. The relationship is fixed in mortar. This is why the careful burial of older ruins, rather than their total pulverization, was so significant. A clean slate would have erased the evidence of the conquest. A palimpsest preserves that evidence but frames it entirely on the conqueror's terms. The old temple is not gone. It is now a footnote in the foundation of the new palace. Its continued existence in the dark earth serves the new narrative. It proves there was something to conquer, and therefore someone mighty enough to have done the conquering. The site becomes a trophy case with the spoil of war, the very sacred heart of a people displayed under glass, or rather, under tons of imperial marble. Every stone in the new construction points back to its own necessity. We built this because we overcame that. The Roman Forum is a classic example of this palimpsest in action. It is not a collection of buildings from one era. It is a dense jungle of layered time. A republican temple pokes up beside an imperial basilica, which itself was built over an even older marketplace. Later medieval churches were squeezed into the shells of ancient temples. Walking through it, you are physically navigating a timeline of supersession, where each generation built upon and responded to the symbols of the one before. The emperors, by placing their grandest buildings in this already sacred political space, were inserting themselves as the latest and greatest chapter in a story that stretched back to the kings of legend. They made themselves the inevitable conclusion to Rome's long narrative. This concept reaches its most philosophical form in the way these sites manage memory. A palimpsest does not allow you to forget the old text. It forces you to remember it through the lens of the new one. For the conquered population, living next to a palace built over their ancestral holy site, the past was not absent. It was a constant, painful presence, but a presence that had been captured and redefined. Their history was now officially a precursor, a prelude to the main event which was the current emperor's reign. The layered monument actively shaped how they remembered. It taught them that their most sacred memories were now foundational, yes, but foundational to someone else's glory. This is the ultimate power of the architectural palimpsest. It doesn't just claim land, it claims the story of the land. It asserts that all previous chapters were merely building toward this moment, this ruler, this empire. The emperor becomes not an interruption in history, but its fulfillment, with every layer of stone beneath his throne serving as proof. The stones of these new palaces did not move themselves. This final, brutal layer of the strategy reveals the conqueror's ultimate demand, not just for the land, but for the very spirit of the conquered people. To dismantle a sacred site required intimate knowledge, a familiarity with its construction and its meaning. Who better to perform this sacred demolition than the people who had built it, who had worshipped there for generations? The use of captive and slave labor for this specific task was a calculated act of psychological warfare, transforming an act of spiritual violation into a prolonged public ritual of humiliation. It forced a community to become the literal instruments of its own cultural erasure. The sacred space was not merely taken, it was deconsecrated by the very hands that had once maintained its holiness. This went far beyond economic efficiency. It was a process designed to break the internal bonds of a culture, to turn pride into shame and devotion into coerced toil. The message was inescapable and repeated with every stone pried loose. Your gods cannot protect you. Your most cherished traditions are now my building materials, and you will provide the labor to make it so. The act of building thus became a continuous performance of total dominance, witnessed by all. Imagine the scene not as a historical abstraction, but as a devastating human experience. Priests who once chanted prayers were now ordered to clear the rubble of their own altar. Stonemasons whose families had carved divine images for centuries were now tasked with cutting new blocks for the conqueror's throne room. This forced participation created a terrible internal conflict, a severing of a people from their own past. They were made complicit in the act of overwriting their own history. The sacred site, once a source of communal identity and strength, was transformed into a prison of forced labor, its spiritual energy now powering the engine of their own subjugation. We see echoes of this in the biblical narrative of the Babylonian exile, where skilled artisans and elites from Judah were taken captive to serve the imperial projects of Babylon. While not always a direct temple-over-temple construction, the principle was similar. The conqueror absorbed the talent and knowledge of the vanquished, using it to enhance his own glory while depriving the conquered homeland of its cultural architects. This practice ensured that the memory of home was not just a longing, but a skill put to use for the enemy's benefit. In the Roman world, the vast construction projects following a conquest, including palaces and triumphal monuments, were famously built by slave labor, often drawn from the ranks of the defeated. Building the victor's monument with the sweat of the vanquished was the ultimate stamp on a finished conquest. It turned human beings into living, breathing components of the new imperial landscape. The psychological impact of this cannot be overstated. It created a legacy where the descendants of the conquered would walk through the grand capital and know that their ancestors' forced toil was in every column and foundation. The splendor was a testament to their own historical defeat. This grim logistics completed the cycle of imperial alchemy. First, the sacred site's spiritual power was captured by its location. Then, its physical substance was harvested as building material. Finally, the living memory and skill of the people connected to that site were conscripted to perform the transformation. Every element of the old world was systematically repurposed. The genius Loci, the spirit of the place, was now surrounded not by free worshippers, but by captive laborers, its energy seemingly subdued by the very community that once nurtured it. This raises a haunting question about legacy and memory. What does it do to a people to be forced to build their conqueror's dream upon the grave of their own? And in the silent endurance of those stones, which story ultimately speaks louder, the one proclaimed by the emperor who ordered it, or the one whispered by the countless unknown hands that were compelled to make it real? The ultimate goal was not to appear as a conqueror, but as a custodian. This architectural strategy performed a breathtaking magic trick on history itself. By building his palace directly upon the sacred ruins, the emperor created an optical illusion of spontaneous authority. The new structure did not look imposed upon the land. It looked as if it had grown from it, as naturally and inevitably as a mountain peak rises from its base. The ruler's divine right was no longer a claim he had to shout. It was a truth the very earth beneath him seemed to whisper. This illusion worked by crafting a visible lineage in stone. A person looking at the magnificent new palace would not see a violent break with the past. They would see a seamless progression. The old sacred site, whether a temple mound or a holy spring, was the first chapter. The gleaming palace above was the magnificent, logical conclusion. The emperor positioned himself not as an interruption, but as the fulfillment of a story the land had been telling for centuries. His authority seemed to emerge organically from the soil, as if the genius Loci itself had been patiently waiting for this specific ruler to arrive and complete its purpose. This narrative was powerfully reinforced through ceremony and daily life. The emperor would often perform rituals that explicitly linked him to the older traditions of the site, perhaps offering prayers at a repurposed altar or holding court on a date significant to the previous cult. He wasn't erasing the old calendar, he was claiming its most potent moments for his own reign. For the common people, this created a persuasive, if unsettling, sense of continuity. The solstice sun still marked the year, but now it shone through the windows of the emperor's hall. The sacred spring still flowed, but it now bubbled up in his private garden. The rhythms of life felt familiar, yet their meaning had been gently, irrevocably redirected toward the throne. the architecture itself was the primary storyteller. Builders used design elements to create visual harmony between the old and new. In Peru, Inca masons would sometimes construct their famously precise walls to complement the natural shape of a sacred boulder, making the new construction look like a respectful extension of the ancient form. In Rome, the Flavian Palace complex was designed to incorporate views of older monuments, framing them within the emperor's domestic space, as if they were cherished heirlooms in his collection. This careful curation made the palace feel like the latest and finest piece in a long-standing collection, not a foreign object dropped onto the landscape. The result was a masterful blurring of lines between innovation and tradition. The emperor could present every modern luxury, every technological marvel in his palace, as the natural flowering of the land's inherent potential, finally realized under his wise stewardship. He hadn't brought progress from the outside. He had simply unlocked what was always meant to be. This made resistance feel not just dangerous, but somehow unnatural, like arguing against the growth of a tree from its own seed. The ruler's power was made to feel ecological, woven into the very environment, as permanent and unquestionable as the hill it stood upon. This illusion of spontaneous authority was the silent strategy's most potent effect. It turned a political revolution into a perceived evolution, making the emperor's rule feel less like a human decision and more like a geographical destiny. But this strategy of building upon the past was not the only path to power. Some emperors chose the opposite route, sending a different kind of message with their stone and mortar. They turned their backs on the old sacred centers entirely, packing up their court and marching to a brand new capital built on virgin ground. This act of abandonment was not a retreat. It was a declaration of independence from history itself, a statement just as powerful and just as calculated as building upon a ruin. The choice between superimposition and abandonment reveals two distinct philosophies of rule, two different answers to the same eternal question. How does a new ruler relate to the legacy of the old world? Consider the founding of Constantinople. Emperor Constantine the Great did not attempt to rebuild Rome's Palatine Hill in the east. He did not try to superimpose his Christian vision upon the Capitolium in Rome, saturated as it was with pagan memory. Instead, he chose the ancient Greek city of Byzantium and transformed it into a new Rome, a Christian Rome from the ground up. The message was one of clean slate creation. Constantine was saying that the old imperial system, with its pagan heart, could not be redeemed or overwritten piecemeal. It had to be left behind so a purer, divinely ordained empire could be born in a new location. The new capital's sacred center would be the Church of the Holy Apostles and later Hagia Sophia, structures built for a new faith, not atop the temples of the old. This was a proclamation of renewal so total it required a new geography. The emperor wasn't capturing the old genius Loci. He was inviting a new one to take root, one that owed its existence entirely to him and his god. This pattern repeats in the East. In Japan, for centuries the imperial capital would be moved with each new reign, a practice known as Sento. While later rooted in Shinto concepts of ritual purity, the early political effect was profound. By establishing a new capital, the incoming emperor avoided the accumulated bureaucratic weight and entrenched power structures of the previous court. He wasn't building over his predecessor's palace. He was leaving it to decay, a silent monument to a reign that was now conclusively over. His authority was not drawn from the past, but from the act of founding anew, demonstrating his vitality and his command over people and resources. The old capital, abandoned, became a ghost, while the new one pulsed with the energy of a fresh beginning. Perhaps the most dramatic example of abandonment as a power statement comes from ancient Egypt. The pharaoh Akhenaten utterly rejected the vast, complex religious system centered on Thebes and the god Ammon. He did not build a new temple to his sole god, Aten, within the old sacred precincts. He ordered an entire capital city, Akhenaten, to be constructed in the middle of the desert on a site with no prior sacred or urban history. This was the ultimate act of ideological separation. By building away, Akhenaten was loudly, visually severing his reign from the priesthood and traditions of the past. His new city, with its open-air temples to the sun disk Aten, was a manifesto in limestone. The message was revolutionary. True power comes not from absorbing the old, but from rejecting it and creating a new world order in a place untainted by history. Of course, this strategy carried immense risk. When Akhenaten died, his capital was abandoned, his monuments defaced, and his religious revolution reversed. The old powers in Thebes reasserted themselves, proving that a genius Loci cultivated for centuries can have a powerful, vengeful memory. So, what determines an emperor's choice? The decision to build upon or build away from sacred ruins hinges on the story he needs to tell. Superimposition, the act of building over, crafts a narrative of continuity and inevitable succession. It says, "All that came before was preparation for my rule. I am the heir, the culmination." It seeks to harvest the legitimacy of the past while dominating it. It is a strategy of absorption, ideal for a conqueror who needs to placate a large, established population by offering them a thread of connection, however thin, to their heritage. Abandonment, in contrast, crafts a narrative of purity and revolution. It says, "The past is corrupt, exhausted, or irrelevant. My power springs from a new source, a new god, a new ideology, a new vision, and it requires a new space to flourish." It is a strategy of separation, often chosen by radical reformers, religious founders, or dynasties that rise through internal revolt rather than external conquest. It boldly risks the stability of tradition for the potential of an uncontested new beginning. Both are high-stakes gambles. Building over risks the whispers of curses, the lingering loyalty to the buried gods, and the psychological burden of ruling from a site that is, for many, a monument to their own subjugation. Building away risks severing the lifeblood of tradition, appearing illegitimate, and failing to cultivate the deep roots of a genius Loci, leaving the new capital feeling artificial and vulnerable. In the end, whether an emperor chose to build his palace upon a sacred ruin or in an empty desert, he was engaging in the same profound act, writing his claim to power directly into the landscape. One used the past as a foundation, the other used its absence as a canvas. Both understood that to rule people, you must first command their imagination, and nothing shapes imagination more powerfully than the unchanging, silent testimony of stone and earth. The silent language of stone and earth did not end with the fall of ancient empires. It simply found a new vocabulary. The logic that drove an emperor to build his palace atop a sacred ruin is a political technology that has never gone out of style. In our modern world, where power is often seen as abstract or bureaucratic, this same strategy of symbolic placement continues, written now in the steel and granite of state architecture. The manipulation of space to manufacture legitimacy and command collective memory remains a foundational act of any authority that wishes to appear both timeless and inevitable. Look at the world's great capital cities, and you will see this ancient blueprint etched into their very street grids. Consider the National Mall in Washington, D.C. This grand, open axis is not a natural feature. It is a carefully designed ceremonial landscape, a stage for national identity. The United States Capitol building, the seat of legislative power, was deliberately placed on Jenkins Hill, which was renamed Capitol Hill in a direct, conscious echo of the Palatine Hill in ancient Rome. The founders of the new republic were steeped in classical history. By choosing this name and this elevated site, they were forging a symbolic lineage. They were saying that their new experiment in democracy was not a radical break from history, but the rightful heir to the republican virtues of Rome. The ground itself was made to whisper of an ancient legacy, even though that legacy was borrowed from a continent away. The entire mall functions as a machine for memory, with monuments and museums placed along its length to tell a specific, curated story of national progress and sacrifice. Similarly, in Brasilia, the purpose-built capital of Brazil, the architects Oscar Niemeyer and Lucio Costa did not work with a blank slate of empty meaning. They created a symbolic landscape from scratch, designing the city in the shape of an airplane or a bow and arrow, depending on the interpretation, with government buildings placed along a monumental axis. The Plaza of the Three Powers, where the executive, legislative, and judicial branches reside, is a vast, open space meant to evoke transparency and forward-looking modernity. By building an entirely new capital in the country's interior, the government was making a powerful spatial statement. It was turning its back on the colonial and imperial history embedded in the coastal cities like Rio de Janeiro, declaring a new era of development and interior colonization. The site's previous lack of significance was its greatest asset. It held no competing memories to overwrite, allowing the state to implant its own narrative directly into the earth. This practice extends beyond capitals to individual buildings of immense symbolic weight. In Berlin, the Reichstag building, the home of the German parliament, carries a history of fire, dictatorship, and division. After German reunification, the decision to restore it and make it the seat of government again, rather than build something entirely new, was deeply symbolic. The architect Norman Foster's iconic glass dome, placed atop the old stone structure, was a transparent statement. It literally and figuratively placed the workings of a modern, open democracy atop the heavy, fraught history of the German state. The building does not ignore its past, it incorporates it, using the scarred stones as a foundation for a new, hopeful transparency. The past is not buried, but it is capped by a new, guiding principle. Even the choice of building materials speaks this silent language. The use of local stone for a parliament building ties the government to the land, suggesting it is a natural outgrowth of the nation itself. The soaring height of a capitol dome aims to inspire awe and submission, much like the towering ziggurats of Mesopotamia. The long, imposing staircases leading to entrances force a physical ascent, recreating that ancient feeling of approaching a sacred, elevated power. These are not accidental design choices. They are the modern equivalents of aligning a throne room with the solstice sun. They are about choreographing emotion and belief through geometry and space. What we witness in these modern examples is not the capture of a pre-existing sacred genius loci, but the active creation of one. The state becomes the author of its own sacred geography. It identifies a site, a hill, a field, a historically charged ruin, and through the act of construction, imbues it with new national significance. The message shifts from "your gods now serve me" to "our shared destiny and ideals are anchored here." The goal remains the same, to root authority in something that feels larger than any individual leader or political party, something as permanent as the landscape. This reveals a profound continuity in the human exercise of power. Whether an emperor seeking the mantle of a forgotten god or a modern republic building its temple of democracy, the instinct is identical. To rule effectively, you must first design the stage. You must compose the silent, spatial symphony that everyone will move to, making your authority feel less like a human invention and more like a natural law, as enduring and unquestionable as the ground beneath our feet. Yet for all the patterns we can trace, history often leaves its clues half-buried. The grand narrative of deliberate superimposition is not a closed book, but a field alive with fierce debate. At the heart of these disputes lies a simple, haunting question. Are we seeing a conqueror's master plan, or are we, centuries later, imposing a story of our own onto a pile of old stones. Some of the most famous sites in the world are caught in this scholarly crossfire, their true meaning obscured by time and interpretation. Take the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, one of the most contested pieces of earth on the planet. The layers here are profound. The first and second Jewish temples stood here, the holiest site in Judaism, after the Roman destruction centuries past. Then, in the late 7th century, the Dome of the Rock was constructed by the Umayyad caliphs. Its magnificent golden dome now dominates the skyline, built directly over the foundation stone, the very rock believed to be the site of the biblical binding of Isaac and the location of the Holy of Holies. The traditional interpretation is a textbook case of spiritual and political superimposition, a new faith building its shrine atop the most sacred ground of the old. Yet some historians and archaeologists propose a more complex, less intentional reading. They point to the long gap between the temple's destruction and the dome's construction, and to evidence that the area may have been used as a garbage dump or left in ruins by the Byzantine authorities. Could the Umayyad builders have been less interested in a direct statement of conquest and more in reclaiming a majestic, abandoned platform for their own glorious monument to God? The debate is not just academic. It cuts to the core of how we understand the motivations behind some of history's most iconic buildings. Was it a deliberate act of overwriting or a pragmatic choice for a spectacular foundation? Each interpretation tells a vastly different story about power and memory. Similar questions swirl around the great church of Hagia Sophia in Constantinople. We've seen it as Justinian's ultimate act of overwriting pagan and earlier Christian sites. But some researchers digging into older texts and scant physical evidence wonder about the hill's use in the decades before Constantine. Was the pre-Christian temple there still an active, vibrant center when he chose the site, making his basilica a direct challenge? Or had it already faded into obscurity, making his choice more about practical urban geography than spiritual combat? The answer changes the emotional weight of every stone. If the pagan temple was already a ruin, then Constantine's act feels more like founding than conquering. If it was still pulsing with life, then the construction of Hagia Sophia becomes one of history's most decisive acts of architectural capture. The evidence is fragmentary, leaving room for both stories to breathe and for the truth to likely lie somewhere in the nuanced middle. These debates extend to the New World. At the Inca site of Pachacamac near modern Lima, a huge pre-Inca temple complex dedicated to a creator god was a pilgrimage center for centuries. When the Inca Empire absorbed the region, they did not destroy the old temple. They built their own temple of the sun right beside it on the same sacred ground and took control of the oracle there. This looks like a classic case of incorporation, capturing the site's spiritual authority. But some archaeologists ask, was this a respectful act of syncretism, acknowledging the power of the local god within the Inca cosmic framework? Or was it a ruthless bureaucratic takeover, a hostile annexation of a rival spiritual franchise? The silent stones do not clearly say. The Inca left no written records, so we must read their intentions solely through architecture and the accounts of their Spanish conquerors, who had their own reasons for framing the story a certain way. The line between veneration and domination in cases like this can be vanishingly thin. These unresolved debates matter because they remind us that the past is not a puzzle with one solution. They highlight the role of accident, pragmatism, and later myth-making in shaping the sites we think we understand. A ruler might build on a hill for its defensibility, and only later do chroniclers invent a story about it being the home of an ancient dragon he slew, retroactively creating a sacred lineage. Nature itself can conspire to confuse the record. A sacred spring might dry up, its ritual significance forgotten, leaving a later palace builder to simply see a convenient water source, unaware he was building over a hallowed site. Future discoveries hold the key to shifting these debates. Ground-penetrating radar and LiDAR scans are now revealing buried structures without lifting a single trowel. At a site like the Roman Forum, new technologies might one day map the exact footprint of the earliest shrines beneath the imperial palaces with such precision that we could understand their orientation and relationship to the later buildings in a whole new way. In Mexico City, ongoing excavations around the Templo Mayor continue to surprise, each new layer offering a clearer picture of what the Spanish actually saw and chose to build upon. The greatest future discovery, however, may be a textual one, a single clay tablet, a forgotten chronicle, or a deciphered script could suddenly illuminate the true intention behind a contested building project. It could tell us whether an emperor's architects consulted priests of the old cult, or whether they simply ordered the site cleared with indifference. Until such a find, these places remain open questions, their stones holding multiple, conflicting truths. This uncertainty is not a flaw in the historical record, but its most compelling feature. It forces us to hold two ideas in our minds at once, to see the palace not just as a symbol of one man's power, but as a vessel into which every generation pours its own fears, its own need for a story. The debate itself is a continuation of the site's power, a modern form of wrestling with the genius loci. And so, the conversation between the present and the past continues, not in declarations, but in questions whispered over excavation pits and debated in scholarly journals, ensuring that these ancient foundations never truly settle into a single, silent story. So why did this blueprint for power appear again and again across the globe? The answer is not a single thread, but a tightly woven cord of spiritual hunger, political necessity, psychological insight, and even cold practicality. At its core, building over sacred ruins was a holistic strategy for manufacturing legitimacy in a world where the divine and the earthly were inseparable. Spiritually, it was an act of profound alchemy, an attempt to capture and redirect the genius loci that accumulated energy of a place into the foundations of a new regime. Politically, it was permanent, silent propaganda, a monument that declared victory not as a past event, but as the present reality for every citizen who lived beneath its shadow. Psychologically, it disoriented the conquered by preserving the geography of their identity while forcibly rewriting its meaning, offering a painful thread of continuity that could demoralize resistance. And practically, while immensely difficult, it often provided a ready-made ceremonial center and a supply of building material, turning the very substance of the old world into the literal bedrock of the new. This multifaceted strategy was remarkably effective for its time. It allowed emperors to present themselves not as destroyers, but as heirs and renewers, curators of history who had arrived to fulfill the land's deepest destiny. It created an illusion of spontaneous, natural authority, making their rule seem as inevitable as the hill their palace stood upon. The legacy of this practice is written into the skyline of our world's oldest cities, in the layered stones of forums and temple mounts, in the very words we use, like palace from the Palatine. These sites became the ultimate palimpsests, holding multiple histories in a single space, one civilization literally supporting the next. That layered reality invites us to look at the world's most famous monuments with new eyes. The next time you see a photograph of a grand cathedral, a sprawling imperial citadel, or even the gleaming capital of a modern nation, pause for a moment. Look beyond its beauty and scale, ask a quieter question: what rests beneath its foundations? The answer is rarely just rock and soil. Often, it is a story of a sacred grove, a venerated spring, a temple to a forgotten god, or the palace of a vanquished king. These places are not single statements, but conversations in stone, where power has long spoken in a silent language of superimposition and capture. By listening to that silence, we begin to hear the full, complex, and deeply human story of how authority is built, and how the past is never truly buried, but patiently waits layer upon layer for us to understand.